Hello there. Today I have a slightly different format for you. I have been sent a video by IPSE and have permission to retransmit it. What follows is a Brexit debate earlier today between Sir Vince Cable and Iain Duncan-Smith at a joint policy conference of the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed and Demos, called Modern Working, the Age of Self-Employment. The Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed, short name IPSE, is the representative body for the UK's self-employed community, including freelancers, contractors, consultants and independent professionals. Demos is Britain's leading cross-party think tank. They have spent over 25 years at the centre of the policy debate with an overarching mission to bring politics closer to people. Demos has researched and produced a major new report on self-employment in the UK, which will be launched at the conference.
Now, Iain, can I start with you? Can you give us a sense from your perspective of where you think we are in the negotiation? It can be quite difficult sometimes as an outside observer to interpret the various positions that are struck, because of course they're sometimes negotiating positions and they're not meant to be taken quite literally. So can you give us your interpretation of where you think we've got to and where you think we're heading?
Well, I don't think we've even started or engaged in what you call the detailed grind of negotiating the free trade arrangement, which is what the government wants at this point. I think there's still some shadow movements around from both sides, a little bit of posturing going on, some public political statements. I think that process literally has to start, but it will start, I think, the moment the government decides what form of arrangement with regards to customs it's finally putting forward to the EU as its position, and then I think we start the rest of it. But until that point, I think it's just short of that moment. But it has to get on with it pretty quickly because we've got a limited amount of time.
Yeah, and a government with no majority in its own right, it's a very delicate balancing act, isn't it, within a party which has different views. And can you say, what would you not be prepared to see? I mean, you mentioned the customs union. We've heard there's been reports recently that perhaps that's a compromise the government might offer, some sort of bespoke customs union. Would you be prepared to stomach that?
Well, I just generally don't see how you can once you leave the EU, I think it's a reality that you must leave the customs union, because one of the great positives about leaving the customs union if you leave the EU is that you set your own arrangements around tariffs. And by the way, the customs union, it's always worth reminding everybody, is not just about tariffs. It's massively about alignment of goods in terms of the regulations and everything else, which will be set in Brussels. So I think the worst of all worlds would be to have a customs union agreement in which, whilst we're out of the EU, we're locked into what the EU wants us to do with regards to tariffs and with regards to arrangements around goods, etc., and services. So that would be a problem. Therefore, the question that you ask is, what actually do we really mean? And I think it comes back to the point, instead of saying customs union or no customs union, what we really need to get down and discuss with the European Union is, what is our trading relationship going to be with you and with us directly after we leave, and how do we therefore get to that end point in the period that's left to us? And I think that's the key question. I think this is a political debate. We go on about customs unions, special customs unions or whatever. The truth is, what's our trading relationship with them, and how much flexibility does that give either side of us? Because if we were in this customs partnership that there's some debate about, which I think is a non-starter, by the way, but if it were, the European Union would have to be collecting tariffs for us at their borders, and we'd have to collect tariffs at our borders for them, which is unbelievably complicated. I think we'd make a mess of it.
Vince, can I come to you on that question? Do you think there's any prospect of preserving Britain's place in the customs union, or do you agree with Iain that actually, if you're going to leave the European Union, that's what leaving the European means?
Well, I think that's a very absolutist position. I think there are a lot of pragmatic people. The jargon soft Brexit applies to them, who accept, in a way that I don't, that there are a lot of people who accept that we are leaving the European Union, but who want to preserve the essential economic foundations, which is what we joined in the first place. And there are two elements to it. One, of course, is the single market, which is this alignment of regulations, absolutely critical to many of our industries, whether or not they trade with Europe. And then there is the customs union, which is external trade policy. And I think it's quite possible the government may be defeated on the customs union issue, because this is one of the areas where all the opposition parties are aligned, and quite a significant number of Conservatives agree with this, because there are two fundamental problems with leaving the customs union. One of them is the Irish border question, which has not yet found an answer. I suspect it never will, but it hasn't yet found an answer. And the other are the very, very serious problems of our supply chain industries, the most obvious being cars and aerospace, where you have investors who've come here based on the assumption that Europe is a friction-free market. There are widgets flying around backwards and forwards, which currently are not subject to checking for rules of origin, and would be if we left the customs union. And those are two fundamental problems which I think a lot of practical people, even people who are, say, pro-Brexit, accept have to be addressed, and would argue for staying in the customs union. I think it will happen.
I want to come back to the economic questions in a moment. Can I just pick up something you said in passing at the beginning there, which is you don't yet actually fully accept we are leaving the European Union. I mean, this is a position that Andrew Adonis has been taking on his listening tour of the country, which it seems to involve quite a lot of Andrew telling people things, as far as I can see. But can you just talk me through how that process would happen, how we would not leave the European Union, and how that would be managed as a politically legitimate thing to do?
Well, I think there's a whole series of steps involved in Brexit. We have the divorce settlement, which we're going through at the moment, and there are three elements to that. The cash payments, which is sort of resolved, I think. It's quite costly, divorce, but there is agreement. There is no agreement on the Irish frontier, and there seemed to have been agreement on the European citizenship question, except that last week's exposure of rampant incompetence and unfairness in the Home Office has fresh doubt on that. So there's 1.5 out of 3 issues resolved on the divorce settlement. There are future issues completely unresolved about our role in the customs union. There's the question then about what kind of trade agreement is negotiated after the so-called transition. At the moment it is completely open as to what happens. We don't know how the European Union are going to respond and whether any meaningful agreement is going to be reached. Now, in the autumn, this combination of things will be a bit clearer than it is now. I think Parliament will then be given a meaningful vote on the question about knowing what the terms of leaving are. Do we want to leave? Or do they just go ahead with what the government has agreed? It's possible, we don't know, that by then the public mood will have changed, Parliament will be more robust in questioning what the government's doing, and then the whole issue will then be thrown open again. And my view is that at the end of this process, the public should have the final say, and that would come out of a rebellion in Parliament in the autumn.
Right. Iain, I know you think this question should be settled and shouldn't be reopened, but do you think it is? Do you think that the proceedings in Parliament this autumn will be the most momentous parliamentary occasions on Europe since Maastricht, or do you think it actually will just pass and we'll leave the European Union quietly in March 2019?
I think everything we do at the moment is tasked as momentous, I have to say. So it's difficult to say. We've reached the...
You're allowed to be boring if you want
uber
to.
superlative, by the way, now. So it's impossible to get superlatives higher than the superlatives we use on a daily basis. It's a process, and at every stage there are issues for the government to settle and are not. If you want my view about this, I obviously profoundly disagree with Vince's new position on this, which is that it's not settled and the referendum didn't settle it. I believe that if Parliament gives the public a vote to say they want to leave and they vote to leave, then you have to respect that and get on and do it. And the rest, as I say, is about negotiation and getting the best deal that you can between the two friendly allies who want to remain good friends and allies and get on and trade.
Okay, let's come to the economic question. I mean, you saw the poll we did in this room just before we stood up. I don't know if you did. Well, it was 80% thought that the effect of us leaving the European Union would be negative in economic terms. And we've got an audience here of the self-employed and their representatives. What can you say to this audience and then also to a broader audience to put the case that leaving the European Union will be good for us economically. Not just that it won't be bad, and it won't be the cliff edge that the Remain side suggested, but actually there are great opportunities and it's going to be a good thing.
I'm not surprised that people are fearful of change, because change is what's happening on a grand scale.
Conservatism, I think it used to be called.
Well, yeah, in a sense, it was often different from the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
So I don't think Thatcher was ever convinced about that. But the reality is that I'm not surprised that people are concerned, because it's very difficult if you're used to doing things one way and then we now come along and say it is going to change. People will fear that change. It's necessary. My view is, however, this offers a massive opportunity to change the way and the terms of business that we are in at the moment, industrially. I mean, one of the areas we've just finished at the Centre for Social Justice publishing a report on productivity and what has been the big problem in the UK and where it is, and some of the findings in that are really linked to the way that we have somehow got into, I think, a rut really within European trade. And the UK itself has become a low-wage economy, which has meant that very little investment has taken place from industry into training, skilling, and all the things that are necessary to be able to get a workforce in a better position than they are. So there have to be big changes, and we have to look at this from the standpoint of, if we leave, as we want to now, with leaving the customs union and the single market, it means that the opportunities in setting new arrangements around the world mean that we open ourselves up to that competition, but at the same time that offers opportunities to businesses which simply aren't there at the moment. And I think that in itself, for those who are really keen to make the change, offers a real opportunity to change the way we do business both internally in the UK and externally. And one of the problems that you face as a member of the EU is that 10% of our businesses actually export to the EU, but all of them have to import every single regulation and change. That often imposes what I consider to be a cost increase on many businesses who don't rely on European trade. And so the question for them is, once we're out, how do we then treat businesses in terms of where they trade and how they do? And we can reset regulation, we can set the authorities and the costs and the taxation to mirror what we actually think is a very different environment. And that, I think, will be advantageous to many of the businesses sitting in this room, even if at this particular point they don't think so.
Okay, I'll give them a chance to ask that in a moment. But Vince, just a couple of economic questions to you. Firstly, the Remain side relied very heavily during the campaign and subsequently on the supposition that the economic damage will be quite severe and also quite rapid. And it doesn't appear to have been as rapid as it was suggested, to put it mildly. Maybe you dispute that, but if you accept that, can you just say why and when you think that's going to come in? And then secondly, as a practical politician, there may come a day when actually this is over and you have to think about the best course for the country subsequently. Can you see any opportunities from Brexit, notwithstanding, I know that the losses you think there are, but can you see a sunnier future after we leave the European Union as well?
Well, in terms of the economic impacts, it's certainly true. I mean, there were people on the Remain side who engaged in hyperbole, and I think wrongly and foolishly, and it did a lot of damage and affected credibility. I like to think I didn't quite go there, but it did happen. That we can already see what the economic consequences are, even though we haven't yet left. I mean, first of all, there was the biggest devaluation since the Second World War occurred within hours of the referendum. That has fed its way through. It's affected people's living standards through real wages. Secondly, we have a large amount of evidence now of a stalling of business investment because of uncertainty. That will now continue for several years. A whole lot of companies invested in the UK because of the single market and what was associated with it. That's now thrown into doubt. We don't know what comes after the transition. If you're a serious business with large amounts of capital, why would you invest in an uncertain environment? And then thirdly, the movement of people. I know it's controversial politically, but very important for business and economic growth. We're already beginning to see quite serious costs associated with the hospitality industry, health, other areas, universities, tech industries, as European people draining away because of uncertainty about their future. Those are some of the economic impacts. We can already see them. They're not hypothetical. And, for the next few years, it is going to be very bumpy, and I suspect some of those impacts will be greater. Now, your second question, what are the opportunities of Brexit? I struggle to see them. I mean, Iain made the point, which is that we can embark on a deregulatory kind of revolution, which will be great for small business. I mean, the problem with this is that we were already a highly deregulated economy. I mean, all the surveys showed that Britain, next to the US and possibly Canada, had the freest labour markets in the world. This happened in coalition times. I was responsible for the one-in, one-out policies with my Conservative colleagues. We were a pretty deregulated country. The European Union didn't stop us. So this, in a way, this is a bit of a canard. And the government has also said categorically that when we leave the European Union, they're not going to open up labour market and environmental regulation. That's one of the assurances Theresa May and David Davis have given. So where is this going to happen? So if I can be a bit provocative, I think the one area where if you were a politician on the hard left, I think you would see Brexit as an opportunity. I think, in a way, Corbyn and his coterie are acting in an entirely rational way. Because they believe that Brexit will cause a major economic shock. It will then potentially open the way to the kind of extreme politics that they promote. And they also argue that if we leave the European Union, we can then get rid of all these things like the rules around competition, public procurement, state aids, which get in the way of creating a socialist economy in Britain. So if you're looking for opportunities, I think you need to join Momentum.
On that cheery note, I'll come to you for some questions. Does anybody want to ask? I'll take three in a spell and come back to the panel. Yes, sir. I think there's a microphone making its way towards you. If you can just say who you are, where you're from, and a quick question.
Craig Rimmer from the Pensions Advisory Service. I was going to ask about financial services in terms of passporting in, passporting out, and equivalency in respect to Brexit. A lot of talk is in respect of passporting out the city services, but as we open up for new trade, is there a risk in terms of consumer protection, in terms of financial services that might be passporting in to the UK?
Okay. Any more questions? I'll have to think up some more myself if you're not going to. Yes, at the back there.
Yes, Anita Monteith, ICAW, that's the Institute of Chartered Accountants. We are concerned about the pressure on government departments to digitalise in time for Brexit. We know that there are a number of digitalisation projects all going on at the same time, and for us, making tax digital is a fairly big one. We just wonder whether the panel think that it is going to be possible to put in place the new customs digital programme, as well as all the other things. I certainly know that John Thompson has struggled a little bit with that. What has got to give, do you think?
Okay, and one more, and yes, the front here.
Simon McVicker, Director of Policy at IPSE, but I'm an Ulster man from background, so I'm obviously quite worried about the Irish border question and the views of the Irish government and the views of the British government seem to be diametrically opposed at the moment. And if English people aren't worried about it, I'm certainly worried about it.
Okay, let's come back for those. Let's start at the end there with the biggest current impasse in the negotiation. Can you see a way through the Irish question? Make you sound like Gladstone asking you that.
Well, I actually think the Irish question has been politicised hugely by the EU and the Southern Irish government. I think the Irish government is using this with the EU to try and put pressure on the UK to, at this particular point, find a way of staying in the customs union. I don't actually myself see quite what the scale of the problem is here, because the real problem for the Irish government is actually the east-west trade with the UK, not north-south trade. 2% of trade from Ireland goes across the border to Northern Ireland. About 65 to 70% of their trade crosses to the UK and is consumed in the UK. So the Irish government is enormously hooked to the idea of the UK as a consumer of its products and therefore a huge amount of its economy. And therefore, in a sense, this process being played out for the last 6 months has been a way, I think, of putting pressure on the government to somehow commit to an arrangement that either doesn't suit them or doesn't suit the Northern Irish with regards to alignment and everything else. My view about this is it's the cart before the horse. This issue, such as it exists, resolves itself once you've understood and agreed what your relationship is from the moment that we depart from the EU. That's the imperative, to sit down and discuss what does that look like? What does the trading relationship look like? How frictionless is that? What levels of tariffs or zero tariffs are we agreed to do? And how will we get equivalence through, well, financial services, which I'll come to in a second, no doubt, when we talk about the issues around that. Secondly, so my point about this is they need to step back, and I think for the Irish government, the imperative is to work out how we settle the east-west trade, which in itself would encompass then the Irish border. I do not believe there is in any way a reason for the UK, and this, by the way, John Thompson, we had him referenced earlier on, HMRC, when he gave evidence to the Select Committee, he made it categorically clear he saw no reason why, under whatever arrangement was made, there would be a necessity for a set of hard border arrangements at the border between Northern and Southern Ireland. His view was, and I agree with him, that a huge amount of that customs process is done long before it hits the border and after it goes through the border. And even now in Northern Ireland, you know, the deal between Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland, searching for things like illegal arms, is not done at a hard border. I served in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, and there we did man the borders to stop illegal arms. Now they don't do that. That is tracked on both sides through agreement previously. The same goes, in fact, the border demarks two very different tax regimes, and that isn't immediately set to check every product that comes across to see where you paid the tax on it. So my view about this is it has become a political problem, but it is not really a practical issue. It is wholly resolvable, but in the light of the way that we make that trade arrangement settle first. And therefore, I think they would do them well to park that and say, we'll come back to that and then agree how it will be settled after we've agreed what that trading relationship looks like. And they should get on with it now, because it's doing nobody any favours to go around making stupid points, as I heard somebody the other day say it would immediately lead to an increase in violence. There's absolutely no reason why that should happen in any shape or form, as the two countries are hugely aligned in terms of their attitude towards terrorism and their cooperation between police forces. Why that would have to change is a complete mystery to me, and I'm certain it won't change. And I say, I served out there and I saw it at its worst, and there's no reason to go back to that at all.
Vince, presumably you think the Irish border question is more than a rhetorical problem. Am I right in thinking you think there's a real problem?
Yeah, there's a real problem, and accusing the Irish government of politicising it. I mean, I went to see the leaders of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael quite recently, the two moderate parties in Ireland. They're desperately worried about this. And the reason they're desperately worried about it is that gradually, through their efforts, as well as the efforts on the British side, the poison that has affected our relationship with the island of Ireland for decades, centuries, was being drained away. You know, and the Good Friday Agreement was the embodiment of that. They can see very clearly that if we leave the customs union, the single market's also relevant, but the customs union, you have to have checks. If you look at comparable situations between Norway and Sweden, the US and Canada, you have extensive border checks, even with the most sophisticated technology in the world. When you start having border checks, you breach one of the fundamentals of that agreement. It will be politicised, not necessarily by moderate politicians in Ireland. I mean, who are the two leading parties in the north? The Democratic Unionists, who are the only voice of Northern Ireland in Parliament, heavily pro-Brexit in a pro-Remain province, Sinn Féin, who don't turn up for historical reasons. I mean, the potential for friction, not necessarily violence, but the potential for friction is immense.
Can I ask you just for a brief comment on the financial question on passporting, and then maybe a kind of final remark, as time is beating us?
Yes, well, there was the quite important question at the back about digitisation, which is worth noting, because, of course, if Brexit goes ahead, we have to have an enormous step up in digital performance and competence in the Home Office and around customs and standards setting. It's a big quantum leap. This is in a context in which only yesterday, Capita, which is the main provider of IT services to the government, had to be recapitalised and is known to be financially fragile. Britain has a terrible history of big public sector IT projects, and we're loading on top of it major new undertakings which will be very, very difficult to execute competently. In terms of financial services, it also became clear in the last few days that I think the best the city is going to get out of it is some form of a weak form of mutual recognition. Probably passporting is going to be very difficult to deliver. I think people in the city are already accepting that the kind of single market arrangement that they want to continue won't. And you're getting a quiet process, not a dramatic process, a quiet process of relocation taking place by large banking and other institutions for exactly that reason.
Iain, I'm going to give you the last word. I mean, you've been involved in this argument about Britain and Europe for a long time now, and it's kind of run your way. Can you leave us with a ringing clarion call for why it's going to be great when we've left?
Before I do that, can I just pick up 2 points, because I've been desperate to do this. The first is on the HMRC point and digitisation. It's a very good point. However, that process to change that has already, it began, and it would have had to happen whether we left in Brexit or we didn't leave. And if you go and talk to them at HMRC, and having been responsible for the Universal Credit Digitisation Programme once we moved to digital change, which is now rolling out without issues and problems in terms of the system, the way you do it matters, not just whether the problems are, and the way is to bring in all of the digital engineers inside the department, not outsource, and you run it directly in line with the providers, and that is the way to do it, and you control it completely from there, not outsourcing to people like Capita and Co, and that is the lesson learnt from the UC thing. And on the passporting stuff, very quickly, the truth is the city has already looked at that and decided it's not an issue, because they've already, most of the banks have got outlying sources in EU, and they're not really that concerned about it. And after all, it's a capital market, it's a wholesale market, and that is all the retail side. So the big part of the wholesale market is really about what the future imposition of regulations is likely to be, such as Solvency II and MiFID and others. That these are very damaging to the city, far more damaging than anything that might be proposed now. So the city has already agreed that. And you can see just recently all the banks are now talking about increasing the numbers of people in the city, because the city is, as was voted, the #1 global financial centre, and it will remain so. I'll give you one prophecy on that. That will not change, because it is really absolutely perfect in that sense for doing it, and that's why people are here. My look ahead, in answer to your question, is that I genuinely think that, I think those who don't accept the referendum are damaging the UK. I say this genuinely to Vince and his colleagues, because by moaning and meandering on about what happened, you lose the opportunity to shape the future. If we spend our whole time looking back and saying, if only, I wish, I don't like this, I want it to go back to where it was, as though everything that we had from the European Union was somehow perfection. It was not. If it was so great for trade, why do we run this incredible deficit in trade every single year from companies sitting in this room and outside? What was the problem? Why do we run a surplus in trade to the rest of the world, which could be incredibly enhanced by opening our doors to the big growth areas of the world? My view is Britain will now be able to rediscover what really made its economy great before we ground it down, which is its ability to go out, find markets, new markets, trade with those, adapt, and be able to be lighter on its feet than what is becoming a monolith of regulation and difficulty in the EU. And just don't forget that the last point about this is the EU is not standing still. If you look at what President Macron said, if you look at what the President has said, they all anticipate deeper, greater, more centralized control, much greater harmonization over tax regimes, much greater regulation in terms of the way that businesses are run. That's the future of remaining in the EU. We have a chance to shape our future, and for the best for our workforce as well.
It's a shame we have to stop just as we've got really started to get going. I'd imagine that 80% that Kathy found in this room a few moments ago will be down to 10% after that. Maybe we'll test that later. But thank you very much, Iain, for that. Thanks very much to Vince for stepping in at short notice. A really good conversation. Thank you to you all for coming. Please join me in thanking our two guests.
Now you've watched the video, please tell us what you think of it in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Please do like and share this video, and also subscribe to my channel. And when subscribing, please do remember to press on the little bell next to the subscribe button. That way you'll get an alert every single time I put up a new video. Thank you very much for watching.